The Solar Podcast is brought to you by Continental Energy Solutions. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Today on the Solar Podcast, wildlife-friendly solar. My guest today is a repeat guest. Welcome back to the show, Bri Bruce, Director of Marketing for RPCS.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me again.
I'm very excited to talk about wildlife-friendly solar. You know, many authorities having jurisdiction and many consumers are quite concerned about solar arrays. Because it's a change. It is a change to the land. There's no doubt about it. Here in Illinois, you know, we have lots of farmland. Today it's corn and beans being the predominant land use. And we now have a large number of community solar and utility scale solar arrays coming into the state. And I think my personal opinion is that these solar arrays are a lighter impact ecologically if they are properly developed. And so we're going to get into what that means to properly develop and what are some of the guidelines that developers and EPCs can lean on to make their solar projects more ecologically friendly. You wrote a nice little white paper on this topic, which people can find at your website. If you just Google RPCS and wildlife friendly solar, you'll find that download. And I'll put it on screen here at some point during the conversation. But what inspired you to write this article, Bri?
Well, I mean, I kind of consider myself, just a quasi tree hugger, maybe. I'm a big fan of wildlife. And I guess what really kind of kicked it off for me was visiting a site of ours in Colorado. And I had never been to Colorado before. I thought it was beautiful. It was winter time, so there was snow on the ground. And I am so busy kind of fumbling with my camera and setting it up to do some filming of the array that we just finished. And I kind of see something out of the corner of my eye and I look over and I'm looking at this animal and I'd never seen it before. And I just was fascinated. It turns out it was a pronghorn antelope. And I had my camera, it was rolling and I actually recorded myself being like, what the heck is that? And so that really got me thinking of just the different kinds of wildlife you see in and around a solar project. I've been fortunate to have traveled a little bit for RPCS, and Colorado was one of the places that kind of stuck out to me as far as wildlife. I've been to sites in Texas and throughout California, and I always managed to see some form or another of wildlife or, wildflowers, insects, reptiles, that sort of thing. So I think that was really what spurred this paper.
Yeah, I've created a group and our listeners should check this out as well on LinkedIn for pollinator and wildlife friendly solar. So if this is a topic that interests you, go to the group section of LinkedIn and search on this topic. You will find the group and you can join there. I occasionally post articles that I find about this topic. And so let's get into it and work our way through some of the nuances of wildlife friendly solar. And, another way that I refer to this is responsible solar development. Who is doing this well in your mind?
First off, I would kind of like to define responsible solar development. And I think in its simplest terms, it's just not completely bulldozing and decimating a plot of land. Obviously, it's much more than that. It encompasses everything from being mindful of sensitive species that may be located on a proposed site, to being aware of natural water drainages. And I think it's something that applies as much to the actual construction process as it does to the life of the array after the construction is completed. But there are a ton of players in the industry that are kind of leading in terms of sustainability, whether it's to make more environmentally friendly development decisions or to kind of establish initiatives to plant native grasses or wildflowers on their sites, doing things like becoming a certified B Corp. I think everyone can learn by the example being set by some of these firms, taking proactive measures to pursue a more responsible way of conducting business.
I'm glad you mentioned pollinators. Insects are animals. And so when I say wildlife, I like to include insects in that, although I think most people would think of, mammals and um, turtles and snakes and birds. But um, has anybody established formal guidelines for wildlife friendly solar?
Yeah, there's some organizations out there, and there are some developers and EPCs that have put together kind of programs on their own that they are kind of carrying out on some of the sites that they've built. There's a handful of nonprofit organizations that provide a lot of resources, a lot of scientific research and data and studies to kind of help guide developers and installers. There's one in particular that comes to the top of my head that's Fresh Energy, and they've got this program called the Center for Pollinators and Energy, and it's highly recognized by the Department of Energy and the Interior's kind of National Conservation Training Center. So they share a lot of best practices and how to maximize the benefits of pollinator-friendly solar. But of course, all the research is ongoing. This is somewhat of a new development, and we don't know a whole lot about it. So that's, the more we know as an industry, the better we can optimize pollinator habitat on solar farms and kind of the solar energy environment nexus.
Yeah, I agree that Fresh Energy is certainly a thought leader on this subject. And the DOE, including NREL and Argonne National Laboratories, are doing some long-term studies on pollinators for sure. I'm not sure about other wildlife on solar farms. So I will put some links to the DOE programs that I'm aware of. So let's paint a picture for our listeners, though, about, you mentioned, pre-construction, construction, and then post-construction. So there is kind of this life cycle of a project that can have differential impacts. And then I guess we should pinpoint some of the potential impacts. You've got at face value a piece or a parcel of land that is going to get fenced off. How are you going to fence it is one big question, right? Mm-hmm. What type of fence are you going to use? Are you going to use chain link? Are you going to use farm fence? Are you going to use some other type of fencing? Will it have special adaptations? For example, I know that some developers are installing little portals for like turtles, for example, or tortoises, where we have endangered species that will potentially want to migrate through an array, and there's no reason not to, kind of make some special adaptations. All of this comes at a cost, and there's always this cost benefit analysis that developers and EPCs are doing. What do you say about, the big picture? What are we talking about?
Yeah, no, all great questions. I think it's important to note that, of course, during the construction process, there are going to be, shorter term disturbances, things like noise, compaction from heavy equipment, emissions from those machines, soil erosion, but these are all going to be, relatively temporary impacts and can be minimized through careful planning and execution. Of course, if you compare solar construction to something like coal extraction or oil drilling, it's much less destructive. Solar energy can be harvested over and over during the site's lifespan, whereas other types of renewable or non-renewable sources are kind of harvested essentially once, and that's it. and kind of leaves destruction in its wake. Another great thing about solar is that once a array has been built, it's not producing any pollution or emissions. The noise is nominal. It's something like the slightly lower than your household refrigerator. So essentially it has no carbon footprint at that point. It doesn't degrade the land any further, and it can exist virtually undisturbed for a 30+ year lifespan. But it should go without saying that some places just aren't suitable for solar, whether from a terrain or topography perspective, or, considering vulnerable plant and animal life on the site, which is why, proper siting is key. And siting, is something that occurs during the planning phase of a project and refers to determining a project's location. And so this incorporates things like conducting surveys and doing just an overall thorough investigation of the land itself. And when things like wildlife corridors or, as you mentioned, kind of migratory paths and any site that has limitations, that's when, those are determined during the siting process. So it's really important when evaluating a piece of land for solar use, especially when you want to kind of minimize impacts to the surrounding environment. And as far as fencing goes, it's most, if not all sites have some sort of fence surrounding it. It's mostly for security purposes. Site owners want to keep intruders out and protect their assets. But the type of fencing is determined largely by the type of wildlife found on any, one particular site. You wouldn't want the fence to let in large predators, or humans for that matter, but you also wouldn't want the fence to keep out smaller wildlife, as you mentioned, like turtles, or rodents or other reptiles. So it really depends on the guidance that's given. And in this case, a lot of times by a biologist. And we oftentimes will bring in a licensed professional biologist or a geologist to kind of help guide us. Oftentimes solar arrays are built near agricultural land or recreational areas or housing developments, which can pose threats to flora and fauna. And effective fencing can actually preserve the acreage inside the fence boundaries and create a kind of sanctuary where there's not any disturbance or further degradation. And it's isolated and it creates this little haven for wildlife.
Yeah, that's a great point. That while it is a change to the land, if you're taking a brownfield or a cornfield and developing a solar farm, you could be creating habitat, and very likely will be creating habitat for not only pollinators, but birds and other animals, especially depending on how the site is landscaped. We here in Illinois and in several other states around the eastern part of the US now have pollinator friendly checklists. So you can get a robust seed list and, to plant plants that are going to be low growing, but require less maintenance, less mowing, less chemical treatment, and then provide habitat and food for butterflies and bees and birds, etc. And, you can imagine a cornfield is a monolithic structure and it is a virtual desert when it comes to wildlife habitat. Unfortunately, 90% of Illinois used to be tall grass prairie, and it was just completely full of wildlife and buffalo and all kinds of animals. And so in a way, there is a, developing solar farms can be a step back towards a more natural environment. Now, if you're taking wilderness, which would be the case more out west, where we have vast stretches of wilderness that are potentially, desirable to solar developers. And maybe that's relevant to that site you visited in Colorado. Colorado has these vast grasslands that are fairly xeric. They've got, yuccas and grasses and cacti and antelope. And you don't want to, you don't want to harm an endangered population. So I totally resonate with your hiring expert, biologists who can properly assess a site. And that is very, very important. So as far as siting goes, are there other considerations, and has anybody developed a geographic specific checklist to different, ecological zones in the Western United States that you're aware of?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I know that they do these little pollinator friendly scorecards. I also know that, not every plant species is going to survive everywhere. So what you're replanting or what the pollinator habitat that you're establishing on a site has to be obviously suitable for that geographic region. So I'm sure that is something that is available in some resource form or another. But I can't speak to that specifically.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is a fairly new topic, and to our, ecological consultants and engineers out there who are listening, please reach out to me. I'd love to host you on the show and continue this conversation with other experts. You work for RPCS, which is first and foremost, you're doing racking installation. Are you a full EPC? Do you do solar development? Are you doing the full suite of installation on solar farms?
We're really unique. We're kind of a unicorn in the sense that what we offer is very different from other firms in the market. So we're not a traditional EPC, but we do a lot of EPC work. Our kind of focus is, turnkey design, supply, and mechanical installation, along with ancillary services, everything from, geotechs, layouts, design. We work, we've got an in-house design team. We'll do any service or any warranty work on our labor. It really is kind of this whole turnkey solutions package that you get when you work with RPCS.
And you have a exclusive partnership with Array Technologies, which is the second most popular single axis tracker in the world. So our listeners are very familiar with Array Technologies out of New Mexico. And they make a single axis tracker. So your experience is more with trackers. We have installed both trackers and fixed tilt arrays ourselves, but our experience is limited to the Midwest. And, in the dual use arena, including agrivoltaics, of course, the shade that an array casts is potentially useful to grazers or wildlife, right? And it is a change, but it is potentially a useful change. And I don't know if you have an opinion about that as far as the structure of the array, the mechanical structure and the shade that it casts from a wildlife perspective. I'm sure that's a little bit of a double edge, right? Because it is a three-dimensional structure that wasn't there before. And so birds, for example, and insects have to navigate that, but they could also benefit from it in terms of a place to hang out in the shade or get out of the wind or get out of the hailstorm. And so it does provide shelter. What do you think about when you think of the physical structure of a solar array related to wildlife?
Yeah, so I can't really speak on some of the intricacies of fixed tilt systems too much, since at RPCS we're kind of in the business of trackers. But I do know that fixed tilt systems have generally more components than trackers. So, this is going to translate to more time in the field during the installation process, and potentially greater impacts to the environment. You're going to have more soil compaction, more machines, more emissions, more noise. But I think that overall, once the construction is complete, the relationship between the solar system and the plant and animal life will be relatively the same. We work almost exclusively with the array technology single axis tracker.
Yeah, but just thinking about trackers, just think about, okay, there's a single axis tracker here. And, it's a structure, it's 5 feet or 6 feet off the ground. You've got the rows of panels. Is that a positive in your mind for wildlife, or is it it depends on where this is and what wildlife we're talking about?
Yeah, there's a lot of different factors. With a tracker, obviously you're going to have some movement of the system as it follows the sun on its course through the sky. But I've been on a handful of sites where this doesn't really seem to have any obvious impact on the wildlife. For example, a lot of times we see birds build their nests on the motor boxes, and it doesn't interfere with the tracker at all or its performance. And the bird isn't going to build its nest anywhere where it doesn't feel safe. I've got this kind of unspoken rule with some of our crew guys that they know just to they're always sending me photos of bird's nest in the system, or a rabbit den, and they always know to send their wildlife pictures to me. So whether you're looking at fixed tilt versus tracker, I don't really think that there's a huge difference when it comes to the impact that it makes on the wildlife.
Yeah. So I have your report on screen now with that beautiful antelope.
That's what started it all.
Yeah, what a beautiful animal.
Yeah.
And and there's a shot of a jackrabbit, which takes me back to my days in New Mexico, where jackrabbits are very common. We have, as you point out here, animals like lizards, and there's a kit fox. So there's all kinds of potential wildlife on a site, and that's where doing some kind of a survey pre-construction and identifying potentially sensitive populations, and generally speaking, authorities having jurisdiction are going to require this, right? So absolutely. It's a standard practice that you're doing these surveys and identifying potential problem areas where you may want to avoid building an array, because let's face it, there are some raw incompatibilities. If you have a ground nesting bird, for example, that is endangered, you may not want to build a solar array there, because all of the traffic that is going to be on a site post-construction, you are going to be driving trucks and mowers around a site. So I'm not saying that every site is absolutely, just peachy for any kind of circumstance. The devil truly is in the details. So, but this is, as we've identified, I think, it is early days for the standardization of quote unquote wildlife friendly. And I'm sure that there's, that we are embarking on a journey here in the solar industry to make solar a more ecologically friendly form of construction. What else stands out for you about, what's working and what do developers need to improve?
Yeah, I think, there's always room for improvement, especially when it comes to this industry that we work in. There's a lot of resources out there, a lot of research, a lot of developing data that's just coming to light. And, as you mentioned, that this is still relatively new. So we're still learning as we're continuing. Certain states and local legislature are offering incentives. For example, the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target or SMART program offers incentives for things like agrivoltaics. And we've helped customers develop projects under this program. So I think looking into programs or resources your state or local organizations have available is a great first step as far as how you can become more educated. Proper planning is big, knowing the environment that you're going to be working in, understanding all the risks posed to the natural environment and ways to mitigate your impact. And again, it goes back to getting weigh-in from licensed professionals like geologists and biologists that can kind of help keep you accountable for your build and guide you through the ways in which you can develop your project in a more sustainable, responsible way. For those of us that work in this industry, and I think I can speak for a lot of us, that it's not just about the job. We're all in this journey together to build a better, more sustainable future through a transition to clean energy. So we have a responsibility when developing solar to leave this, little corner of the world and its surrounding community, which includes the wildlife, the natural habitat, in a better state.
Very cool. I need to make a couple of quick announcements and then we'll wrap up this conversation. We are promoting a raffle that the Illinois Solar Energy Association is holding. If you go to illinoissolar.org, and I will put that website on screen here, there is a link to win a Tesla. And every year for the last 5 years or so, ICEA has been raffling off a Tesla Model X. Tickets are $100 a piece, or you can get 4 tickets for $300. So you just go to that link, win a Tesla. You can see photos of past winners. And ICEA is our advocacy organization here in Illinois. They work very closely with SEIA and other stakeholders, including solar developers, EPCs, solar installers, both at the residential, commercial, and utility scale. So please support ICEA and buy a ticket to the Tesla raffle. And that raffle is going to be held next spring. So check it out at illinoissolar.org. Back to you, Bri. I did a quick search and I found a paper that I want to highlight also that the Defenders of Wildlife published. They don't have a date on it, but it's called Making Renewable Energy Wildlife Friendly. So that is a Defenders of Wildlife is a 501c3 organization, which obviously is looking out for wildlife in the United States. So you can also check that out, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. If you were a developer though, Bri, and I understand that you're not, but if you were a developer and this topic is weighing on you in some way, where do you go? And who do you reach out to other than Fresh Energy? That's one of the things that's on my mind is SEIA, is NREL, making resources available to developers. So I guess, and if you have answers, I'm all ears. If you don't, that's fine too. I'm on a quest here to give our audience more and better information about how they can become more informed and educated about this topic.
Absolutely. No, we see a lot of our partners, post their information of, their own findings and what they're doing to kind of establish these wildlife friendly solar projects or pollinator friendly habitat. So it's been really great to see and to kind of tap into that as well. I am such a fan of pollinator friendly and dual use solar. So to me, it's just a no brainer. And it's a win-win all around. Not only is the solar supplying clean energy, but the site itself can help restore pollinator habitat, which is providing pollinators with a food source, benefiting plant life beyond the boundaries of the site. It's doing things like contributing to replanting efforts after the construction phase is completed. It's restoring native grasses and wildflowers. Of course, the implications for wildlife friendly solar are enormous. It really gives the key players involved in a project an opportunity to be a steward for the natural environment. So you are seeing, these larger firms come in and share their resources or their findings. And it's not necessarily reserved for, animal life or the wildlife friendly solar, but the plant life as well. Which, all plays into the larger kind of nexus. It provides shelter for the sensitive species. It's promoting biodiversity. It's land preservation and stability, all while kind of creating this coexistence between the solar site and the flora and fauna.
I found just by hosting discussions on pollinator friendly and wildlife friendly solar, that Engie is one of the developers that is quite sophisticated on this topic. And there's a civil engineer there named Gavin Mindshine, who's been on the show talking about pollinator friendly solar. So I will also put links to that recording in the show notes here. Are there other shining stars in your mind when it comes to developers? Because that community of professionals is a very important network, I think, for developers. Those are the go-to resources, I think. Who are the shining stars in the development and EPC community in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of shining stars setting precedents. Our friends, for example, at First Solar, they're huge proponents of sustainability. Their Topaz Solar Farm in California that they helped develop, it was kind of a case study for showing exactly how responsibly developed large-scale projects can provide, sanctuaries for plant and animal life to thrive. Nexamp is another one of our partners, and they're doing a lot of agrivoltaic work. They're using sheep for vegetation maintenance, and they've put in place a formal pollinator program, and they're planting native vegetation to address kind of more responsible land use and maximizing the positive impacts that their projects have. And kind of going along the subject of sheep, research has showed that the gut bacteria in ruminants like sheep and cows actually enhance the soil with natural fertilizers. So this is just another example of the win-win for dual use, providing grazers with food, enriching the soil for healthier plant growth, and then keeping vegetation under control so as not to interfere with the system's production. But no, we've worked with a number of partners on a number of projects throughout the country where we relied heavily on an on-site biologist to kind of monitor our construction practices and then kind of keep us within regulation. One particular example is a project in Lost Hills, California, that we did with Excite Energy. There were a handful of sensitive species The antelope squirrel was one, the coach whip snake was another. But there were two in particularly that were more sensitive than the others. One was the blunt-nosed leopard lizard, and the other was the kit fox, and both of which are state protected species. So the site had to require, special permits to actually limit the amount of disturbance in order to protect those wildlife species there. And so that was an instance where we had a biologist on site to kind of help monitor our work and watch out for that lizard or those foxes, just to kind of make sure that we were not encroaching on them too much. Another example was the project we did for California Polytechnic State University in California. We partnered with REC and Duke for that one. And the site actually had Native American artifacts on it. So that was an instance where archaeologists were brought in. There were Native American tribal representatives there to work with our crews to create buffer zones to ensure that those artifacts were not disturbed. So those are just a couple, key players that we're fans of, our friends, our partners that are making efforts to contribute to, sustainably and responsibly developed solar projects.
Excellent. Well, is there anything else on this topic that you would like our listeners to know about? And then also, please let us know how our listeners can reach you.
Yeah, I think I recently wrote a paper on agrivoltaics. There's a lot of kind of split opinions on whether solar is good for the environment or not, in the sense of like it interfering with the natural habitat. So the question of shade often comes up a lot. The good versus the bad. So I will say that there's been a lot of studies conducted that, and again, these studies are continually being developed because this is a relatively new concept, just to show how vegetation is really not affected by solar development as much as you would think. It has the ability to return to its native state. The plants can regrow, sites can be replanted, and where the vegetation grows, the animals will follow. And it's shown that vegetation can grow relatively well, if not better, in the shaded areas beneath the panels. So this system actually creates this kind of microclimate where it traps in moisture, it can, more evenly distribute shade and sunlight. More so with trackers than with fixed tilt systems, because they move, and the sun is moving also. So you have kind of that shifting of the shaded spots in an area greater than a fixed tilt system. But tests have shown that solar sites generally have a higher percentage of ground cover than the surrounding areas, which is a statistic that I think is really cool. And it makes a great argument for the viability and the success of dual use or agrivoltaics, where you're growing crops beneath solar panels and in and around a solar array. In one particular study that was done by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory proved that revegetation of solar sites after construction was not only just totally viable, but it could establish enough ground cover to provide erosion control and, again, restore that wildlife habitat to its natural state. So as far as replanting goes, this is a great opportunity to have control over what's planted. And again, this goes back to, what you can plant in certain regions and what plants might be more suited to growing in certain environments. And again, you want to be planting as much native vegetation as possible to contribute to kind of the natural order of things. And you don't want to plant anything that's going to interfere with the system, or even certain crop types don't grow well given shade conditions or water scarcity. So, and I do want to mention too that, as far as cost goes, there's going to be associated costs for efforts to replant or to establish pollinator friendly habitat. But I think that there's a huge value to the landowner, to the environment, to the surrounding community, the good that it does and the positive impact that it can have, that just far outweighs the upfront costs in the long run.
Yeah, that's the beauty of certainly pollinator friendly solar here in the Midwest, that if you vegetate a site with native plants and get it properly established, you're going to have much lower maintenance costs in the long run. And then it's a win-win for the environment. You're also getting reduced runoff, as you mentioned, from the site. Runoff is a big problem in the Midwest. We don't want those nutrients running into the Mississippi, running into the Gulf, and contributing to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So there's this dual use is actually multi-beneficial to the ecosystem. Well, I want to thank you, Bri, and I'm going to make a couple of quick announcements, and then we will tell people how they can reach you. I want to encourage our listeners to check out the Solar Podcast. All of our content is at cesnrg.com/podcast. We're doing one of these interviews a week. We bring you great content on solar plant performance with researchers like Paulo Soares, and Solar App, which is making solar permitting much easier. That is an interview with Becca Jones-Albertus, who heads up the Solar Energy Technologies Office at the Department of Energy. And then developers like UGE and Nick Blitterswyk from Canada, who is doing community solar. So all kinds of great topics. And then we're bringing you a show called the Clean Power Hour once a week, also with my co-host, John Weaver, who is a journalist with PV Magazine. We bring you interviews with thought leaders like Cubic PV, developing multi-junction perovskite solar, and then chasing down the latest and greatest news on solar, wind, storage, and the energy transition. So please check it out. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends, and please reach out to me. I love to hear from my listeners. If you have ideas for topics or guests, I'm always looking for great guests like our one today, Bri Bruce at RPCS, and I'll put your website on screen now, rpcs.com. And of course, you can reach Bri through the contact, or what is another good way for listeners to reach you, Bri?
You can always reach out to us on social media. We are on Twitter at RPCS Inc., on Instagram at RP Construction Services. We're on LinkedIn at RPCS, and we're also on YouTube. You can find us there. We've got a lot of great videos, but if anyone would like to reach out to me individually, you can reach me at bbruce@rpcs.com.
I can attest that RPCS is prolific on social media. So I am constantly seeing posts on Twitter and LinkedIn, which are my two favorite platforms, but obviously there's many other ways. So, well, thank you so much, Bri, for coming back to the show. We look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. I'm Tim Montague, your host. Let's grow solar.